In Chapter 10, we'll talk about school as a unique context of development during adolescence and emerging adulthood. As you might imagine, there are some distinct differences when it comes to schooling when we're looking at adolescent and emerging adult populations compared to children. We'll start by going over a brief history of high school in the US and looking at some characteristics of effective schooling. We'll then pick up in video 2 by looking at traits that help and hinder engagement and school achievement, and then end by talking about college. So, to get started, as you might imagine, high school has not always been as big a part of our culture as it is in today's society. You may have heard of primary and secondary school. Just to clarify, primary school means elementary school in the US, while secondary school captures that adolescent period of education, middle and high school. Secondary school was not always a required part of our education system. In fact, laws did not begin to be passed requiring post-primary education until 1890. And from there, it took a long time for the majority of communities to require and even offer substantial secondary education. So this is relatively new, or at least the large role that it plays in our development during adolescence is relatively new. We can compare developing countries to what education used to look like prior to the growth of secondary schools in the US. It's very uncommon, particularly for women, and particularly for lower SES communities in developing countries to have any education past the primary or elementary school age. Luckily, that is changing in many parts of the world as higher rates of industrialization and globalization continue to increase. We have seen an increase in secondary school access in these countries, but it hasn't yet reached the same level as it has in the US. Within the United States secondary school system, we've also seen a distinctive shift in more recent decades away from kind of liberal arts education, where the purpose of high school was just to learn, to be educated, and more towards a focus on skills and knowledge bases that contribute to students' economic development and overall citizenship. So we see a focus on general education where students all have to take math, English, science, etc., etc. We've seen an emphasis on college preparation. You can think of the emergence of AP or advanced placement classes that corresponds with the increased emphasis on getting high school students ready for college. And we've also seen an emergence of vocational training options, where students in high schools actually learn hard skills that they can use later on in their careers. So let's look a little bit more about schools in America. We know that our school systems are locally funded, which is not the case in many countries. Because each school system has their own distribution of fundings, there's actually very little control from the national government, which again is very different from many other countries in the world. Because of that, because school systems or school districts are very localized, we see a very large degree of variability when it comes to the quality of our high schools and when it comes to what's being learned. Each school system is in charge of developing its own curriculum, deciding what students are going to learn and how they're going to learn it. And while that has changed a little bit with the push for common core classes or common curriculum, it's still very much an individualized decision. Each school district also has their own schools and requirements. So if you take someone from one part of the country who's graduated from high school, compare them to someone maybe even within their own state, but definitely from a completely different state on the other side of the country, for example, you're going to see a large degree of differences when it comes to the quality of their education and what exactly their education focused on. One interesting difference that we see in the different school systems within the US is a big degree of variability in the size of classes and the overall school itself. For example, my graduating class, I believe, had about 300 students in it. So my high school itself had about a little over 1,000 students. A good friend of mine went to Jenks High School in Tulsa, and I believe her graduating class had over 1,000 students in it alone. So the school itself had over 4,000 students. Big degrees in differences. And that might lead some of us to wonder, what's an appropriate class size? Are there benefits or limitations of having small or large schools? We know that there are, of course, positive and negative impacts of large class sizes. For example, large schools tend to have more diverse classes, meaning that they offer a much wider range of potential topics to learn about. A larger number of different languages, larger extracurricular activities. And they also tend to offer more skill level classes as well, where you have an easier time finding something you care to learn about at a level that is appropriate for you. On the other hand, we know that students in large schools have higher rates of alienation, where they feel disconnected from their peers and from their teachers. It's harder to form connections with teachers when you're in a large class size, and that can make it harder for some students. So overall, there is no consistent relationship between size and achievement specifically. We know that we see higher rates of engagement, school engagement, with extracurricular activities in small schools. It becomes more of the norm, but again, fewer options for extracurricular activities. So there are pros and cons. There's a lot of individual differences as well, where some students might do better in a large school while others might do better in a small environment. But the recommendation here is to try to keep class sizes between 500 and 1,000 students. What tends to matter more, has a much bigger impact on student achievement than the size of their class, is the climate. School climate refers to the quality of interactions between students and teachers. Specifically, how teachers interact with students, what their expectations and their standards are, and the different methods that they use in the classroom. So what it really comes down to is the quality of the teacher and the teacher's relationship with the students. We like to see teachers who are supportive and involved in their students' learning. And of course, that can be very difficult because teachers in many school districts in our country are way underpaid. They don't have the resources they need. Financial resources end up impacting their psychological resources as well. So that is a big issue in our country at the moment. We also know, and this one may or may not surprise you, that school climate tends to be better when teachers engage discipline when it's appropriate and when they have high expectations of their students, both for academic and behavioral outcomes. So students tend to respond better from teachers who have expectations of them and enforce those expectations, but are also supportive and involved. We do well when we know that our teacher expects us to do well. That's the overarching theme of a positive school climate. When this happens, we see better test scores and lower rates of delinquency. And again, all of this comes down to the concept of engagement. Engagement is the commitment that an individual student has to being alert, to paying attention, to caring, and being attentive to their own learning. Teachers have a big impact on engagement. That brings me to the end of Lecture 1. We'll pick up with Video 2 by diving a little bit more into engagement and the impact it has on achievement, and then we'll end by talking about college.